welcome to the next episode. Oh boy, I'm going to label this one 9B. B for bonus, and it's an interjection that introduces a few things before episode 11 and obviously 10, 9 where we left off. Maths. I wanted to get to moral relativism. Oh boy. The theft, fraud, and perhaps more practical everyday things than these abstract notions of utilitarianism, deontology, and teleological arguments. I'm also going to talk about QAnon. Jesus, what a bag of shit that is. I know things are getting heated up with the US election, and there's much of the script now. It's taking a bit longer. Of course, it always takes longer. It's going to be outdated by the time I actually get to recording them. Only about 80 pages into a 350-page script, and this is another 50-page interjection before I even pick up on episode 10. So this interjection is likely to come into two parts. So we mentioned in the previous video the notion of bear traps. Previously I'd mentioned the news by one US state governor that has taken steps more or less to prohibit protests. Morals and ethics, it seemed pertinent, but towards the end of this episode, when we talk about criticism of religion, we might see how it's tantamount to the same thing. And it crosses the area of why a free press is necessary. I think we mentioned that in the previous video. It turns out another state, Utah, is also at it. There is some legislation going through there to do with escalating fines and prison terms for disruptive behaviour, and they're using police dogs to suppress protesters. And the Utah senator is quoted as saying, "If you don't want to get bit, stay home." You aren't from around these here parts, are you, boy? Set the dogs on them, boys. And I thought my bear trap story was actually exaggerated. So before we get into it all, a quick mention on ontological morality. I think that's the one about morality itself as an actual objective thing. It asks the question, can moral facts exist? I'm a bit wishy-washy on this. To me, it's like truth. Does truth exist in of itself? Well, I'd like to say no, insofar as there are statements that can be made about physical phenomena, for example, that comport to reality. That is to say, apparently true, the statement may be truthful. It may be that such statements are said to be true, where they correctly describe something that's testable, demonstrable, and so on and so forth. But it seems that it's a quality of a statement, a bit like distance. Does distance itself exist? It's true to say things are separated in space-time and that such objects exist spatially separate from one another, and we call this distance. But does distance itself exist? Point to distance. Put distance in a wheelbarrow. Likewise, the question on the landscape and realness of morals seems to be the question that the ontological question asks, and I've no friggin' idea, so sorry on that one. Yeah, so it's one thing to know right and wrong, good and bad, good and evil. It's another to actually do the right thing. How do I get myself and others to actually act on that knowledge? So this is a little bit of the how and the why of it all. What pressures and influences on the, what I like to call person circumstance, because we're never separated from our circumstance, steer our decisions. Of course, before I've mentioned the perceptual issues and preference for virtue or preference for consequentialism or utilitarianism, and anchoring effects and cognitive easing and how our brain is wired, our value hierarchy, how it gets filtered through our perceptions, and perceptions seem to be analog and decisions seem to be digital, and how all that goes on is a bit of a mystery. I wanted to bring up something else, though, a slight tangent, of course, never sticking to the point. Have you heard of the quick-change artists? I'm going to come back to this much later in the series when we get to the example of the hotel room and the discount. I'm sure you've heard that story. The quick-change artist, I've met one or two, well, not, I've experienced them, I've seen them try it on in petrol stations and gas stations. I don't know the script fully, but basically they'll come in with like a $10 bill or a £10 note, and they'll buy something for $1.50 or £1.75, and you give them the change, and then they'll find a £50 note or a $50 note, and they'll go, you know what, I don't want all this change, let me give you a 50, I'll swap the change that you've exchanged me now, and they try and confuse the teller into actually handing out free money in the process of this confused exchange of currency. So one example sees where the teller has actually been upped to giving change on a £50 note and gives them, say, $49 or £49.50 change or something. And then the quick change artist will go, okay, cool, that's $49. If I give you another 50 pence, that's £50, $50, and then it's only another 50 to 100. So if I give you this back, you can give me 100. Now, it's in the language. If I give you this back, well, it wasn't the quick change artist money anyway, but now that the teller has taken what they perceive as possession of that, then they think, yes, this 50 that I'm now holding and the 50 that the quick change artist is proposing that I put in to this makes the 50 I'm holding plus the 50 I'm going to give equal to the $100. Yes, that adds up. Yes, there's $100 or £100, and they hand it over. I haven't done a great job of explaining it. I think I made a mistake in there, but the point is that they use this deep anchoring to convince the teller that they hold money that's actually the quick changed artist's money that's now in excess of what was actually owed. And then it anchors that. So this is what Kahneman talks about, system 1 and system 2 thinking. It's the bat and the ball thing. If a bat and a ball cost £1 and 5 pence and the bat costs £1 more than the ball, how much does the ball cost? Quick as a flash, we do the similar sounding question of what is £1.5 minus £1, it's 5 pence. That is a similar sounding question, but it's not the same question, and the answer's wrong. We're out by 2.5 pence, which is a small percentage, but repeated many times, we're constantly going to lose money. So this is what the quick change artist does. It anchors the movement of this money, and then go, well, I've just given you 50. If you give me another 50, that'll be the 100, and I can walk out with a $100 note rather than lose change, which does me favours, and you've got that 50 and the other 50, and that makes 100, right? Yeah, right, yeah, okay. And I don't want to slow down and check. So this is what I'm talking about. What are dangerous character flaws that people might have that we interact with? Some people don't want to make a fuss. Some people don't want to say, let me close the doors, lock the till, we'll check the money. It's an inconvenience. No one wants it. And the other guy's in a rush because he wants to, and we don't want to inconvenience people, but they know that. And, they use these social pressures against us to make what we think is a morally correct decision. That is, we're helping them out. We're giving them change. We're trying to follow the rules of exchange, but it's actually led us to a poor outcome for us. Good for them. They've just made a load of money. Well, stolen money, let's be honest. But the other fascinating thing about these quick changed artists is how they anchor the money. It's done with the hand as they move the money back. And they're always hovering over the till as well to put extra pressure on, like, why is he looking in the till? And it overloads your mind. And I learned in this in like NLP as well. It's like if you give somebody a sensory input, an auditory question or a command, and then a visual cue, and then introduce tactile inputs, it starts to overwhelm people very quick. And again, it's fascinating to watch these quick changed artists, the way that they position their body, the way that they fast talk, so your auditory is overloaded, and then it's maths as well, which, people generally aren't fast at. And then the hovering over the till, touching things on the till, touching all this money. And it's like, he's got his hands around the till. Is he taking money? What's his game here? I'm being told $50 here, $20 change that. He's in a rush. He don't want small change. Am I going to get in trouble? And it's just overwhelming. And then people just get nervous and want the situation to go away. And I was even listening to a really sad scam with this new one going around, the Amazon scam, where an old dear was conned out of £20,000. And she got so flustered and upset. She said, you know what? I know I've been scammed, but keep the money. I can't handle the stress. I just don't want to know. Prepared to lose 20 grand because she just doesn't want the stress anymore. Hence the question, what are dangerous character flaws that people might have we interact with? How are we persuaded to do good things, bad things? Sociopaths, can they lead you to do something that you wouldn't do? And I have to confess, this has held me back for so long. Where are the limits? What is permissible? What is not? What are my own standards? And I've not fully found them. And I've heard people say to me, life isn't fair. And I think, well, life's what you make it. And if you're telling me life isn't fair, then you've got to expect that if you expect me to live by that doctrine, I'll go all the way. I won't stop. And when you start saying, that's not fair, or you've overstepped the mark, and that won't wash. I don't know, sometimes I think there's a little bit of a sociopath in me sometimes. It comes back to what I said a couple of episodes ago. I've heard people say, let me cut the branches off that tree because it'll help me install the windows. It'll grow back in no time. Don't worry about the financial upfront costs. You'll make the money back in no time. All right, 5 seconds later, that was no time. Where is it? I expect it back. You said it'd be back in no time. Why haven't you done it? It's fucking idiots. Say anything to get their way. Sociopaths. Yeah, it seems a cop-out to say that all human behaviours are valid under the appropriate context. And that's where it gets complicated. And it's where I want to get to with moral subjectivism. I've scripted a little bit on corruption, but that's about 190 pages away, and we've only covered 85, 86 now. They say it's good to know thyself and all that crap. And so in reading around ethics and morals, I've realised I've been so heavily a consequentialist. So much so that it's allowed me to put other people's interests in front of my own, because it was the better argument. It served a greater good. And it's constantly frustrating to be beholden to that. Now think about it. Virtue can be consequentially advantageous in a way that is experienced on an average, but perhaps not individually. Your class rises rather than you rising out of your class. But then I'm all about abolishing class too. This gives rise to the idea that, as well as consequentialist and utilitarian, we also need a kind of reasoning that's best described as character. Moral virtue, I think, virtue ethics. So we have a principle that guides our consequentialism. Rules with tempered outcome, or outcome with tempered rules. Deontology versus utilitarianism, if you like, or teleology. What can you live with? I've heard this question asked. Turns out some humans are capable of living with a wide range of circumstances, and some cannot. But then, and it seems wretched to put it like this, but those who have concluded that the candle isn't worth it, check out an alarming number, and it's on the rise. And in current circumstance, some seem able to make sacrifices and more or less enslave themselves to an awful life of what is barely more than involuntary servitude to give their offspring a better life. I wonder sometimes if the choice to have children is sometimes to give people this kind of meaning to an otherwise awful and wretched existence, which in some way saves them, but also brings their children in a similar circumstance. There are many delicate issues. The morality of ending one's own life, the morality of having children. There have been books written, and they are sitting on my bookshelf. Got to get to them, but opportunity, costs, time. Mentioned in the previous episode that in some cases it strikes me that highly virtuous and religious people see that the purpose and meaning of life is to perpetuate God's image, which means having offspring, which means working to block things like abortion and to block things like contraception, because it's against God's will for more little ones. And therein that, they find that their purpose and their meaning of life, and then wish to impose it on everyone else. Rules versus outcome, perhaps the underlying philosophy of law itself. I gather it's more complicated than that. Well, for example, lots of women in the United States will be glad to know that Roe v. Wade enabled the right to abortions, a very consequentialist outcome. The Roman Catholic Church had viewed such as a form of infanticide, and many fundamentalists joined the outcry, and the National Right to Life Committee was formed with the intention of reversing Roe v. Wade. Some say life begins at conception, some say at birth. The first group says, therefore, abortions are tantamount to murder. The second group does not. The first group calls themselves pro-life, the second group pro-choice. And we mentioned previously the case of the 10-year-old Brazilian girl who travelled 900 miles to get an abortion. As far as I can tell, though, life has an invariant quality about it. It's not that it starts or stops. Human beings are examples of and evidence of life, but are not life itself. I mentioned before with casuistry that we can change the context of these moral issues to talk about ethics and these issues in a safe space. It removes the emotional complications changes the subject matter but keeps the dilemma preserved so that we can talk about it. Consider an oak tree then. When did its life start? When its seed first sprouted, or perhaps when the acorn fell to the ground, or perhaps when the acorn was first formed on its parent tree, or perhaps even this was determined by genetic factors and environmental pressures that meant that certain acorns grew on certain branches. Some were viable, some were not, some fell and some were eaten, some fell into places where they could never get hold and failed to germinate. But if the seed came from the tree before, and the tree before itself was from a seed that its parent tree produced, where exactly does the chain of life start and stop? It seems to me it's self-contained, but an emergent phenomenon between the matter and not of the matter. How far back then should we trace this causality? To the very moment of biogenesis? It all came from the first example of something that we'd call life on Earth. There is some very strange accounting that goes on that I've read about in terms of this counting of lives. That somehow if an abortion happens here, but then 10 births happen there, then somehow those lives are accounted for. It's a fallacy to me. It's like the fallacy of the odds of you being born. Well, you only get to find out the odds after it happened. Therefore, you can never say what the odds are. Therefore, all that bullshit about you, a 1 in 4 billion chance of being born, therefore, you're a winner. It's rubbish. Because it depends on the probability of your parents being born, and that depends on the probability of their parents being born, and back and back and back, and depends on the probability of very first moment of life, or very first moments of, lives. Maybe it didn't originate at a single source, maybe it spontaneously emerged from several sources. This is the great study, abiogenesis. Nothing to do with evolution, by the way. Get on to evolution in a minute. Linguistics, you may say, regardless, you may say whether we call it a new life or a new human being. Indeed, I say, words matter, and I'll refer back to the amusing instance of the change in verbiage that the Catholic Church has suffered when it changed the language of I baptize you to we baptize you. If such adherence to strict rules, see, rules, not consequence, if strict adherence to rule is to be followed, then I assume all such Catholics who are in opposition to abortions will feel they ought not to speak on such matters until they are confirmed as having the appropriate verbiage stated at their particular baptism. We must hold them surely to their own standards. How can they impose rule-based ideology on others when they themselves will not follow their own? But says the diocese, it's intent that matters. Says I. So it's about intent then, which furs an end goal to bring about something, which is a consequentialist position, in which case, taking a consequentialist position weighs the most good for the most number of people, and surely here, in a modern society of technical capability, where the resources required to serve such interests are trivial, and serve many women and improve many lives, and many families and many young girls, gives them options that otherwise these people would prohibit, the freedom of choice is superior. I have to make mention then that Roe versus Wade has been under attack ever since. Pro-life groups began to lobby their senators and representatives to propose a right-to-life amendment to the Constitution. It never really gained enough support. The Hyde Amendment of 1976 prohibited federal Medicaid funds to be used for abortions. In 1992, President Bush imposed the gag rule, because there's nothing like free speeches, that prohibited workers in a federally funded clinic from mentioning abortion as an option. Informed consent? Later, the Democrats reversed this when Clinton came to power in 1993. Time and time again, the right wing seems to have a heavy slant to rule-based living. This is the letter of the law. You have to abide by it, literally. As has the Catholic Church. And they have seen how their own doctrine is so easily undermined by a simple change of I to we. Fuck. A while ago, a Catholic politician running for high federal office declared that she supported freedom of choice on the abortion issue, even though, as a Catholic, she personally opposed abortion. She argued that her personal views were not in conflict with her position on public policy. A Catholic bishop criticised this stance as illogical, replying that he did not see how a good Catholic who should be against the taking of human life can vote for a politician who supports abortion. She replied that, as a Catholic, she does not personally support abortion, but that she feels she has no right to impose that view on others, who may have different religious viewpoints. She stated that her political support of reproductive freedoms of choice is logically consistent with her personal opposition to abortion because of the separation of church and state. This was not about Amy Coney Barrett, by the way, who was talking about interpreting the law as written. Which, by the way, I assume Roe v. Wade is also written. So we shall see. As I understand, in the law books, it is mentioned that there is a thing of textualism. This is where the interpretation of the law is based upon the literal and ordinary meaning of text. The famous one is, of course, the right to bear arms, Second Amendment in the United States. Does that include surface-to-air missile array in the back garden? A textualist approach will ignore context and legislative history. Now, again, I'm way out of my depth. Suffice to say, Scalia, yeah, relevant because Amy Coney Barrett is a mentee of Scalia's. He said that the law is what governs, not the intent of the lawgiver. Alright, see what I'm getting at? Rules or consequence, intent, consequence, rules. I have to be careful here, I might end up agreeing with Scalia. And only insofar as I've not really thought this through to any great extent. I agree, the laws we make are the agreements we make. It ought to be the case then that competent persons construct those agreements. And by competent, I mean in the ways that we reasonably expect. Having standing in the matter, having interest in the matter, mutual understandings and a capacity to understand and a capacity to negotiate such instruments. You, me, anyone else of so-called rational mind. However, when it comes down to the written words, their interpretation and context of meaning, it would indeed be nice if we wrote what we meant. Then, conveniently, the intent would be captured with the agreement, the writing, the law. The issue, I will concede, with doing it the other way and saying, aha, yes, although that's what is written, that's not what I actually meant, kind of renders written agreements quite weak. Intent is one of those slippery things, and I found can be malleable and, as with human memory, quite unreliable insofar as what we recall we thought our intent was at the time. Textualism should not be confused with plain meaning either. Wikipedia gives a couple of good examples from Scalia, as it happens, where the case describes a prosecution presumably seeking enhanced penalties for using a firearm during and in relation to a drug trafficking crime. What had actually happened was that the gun was traded for cocaine. I would not be in the majority who erroneously thought this qualified for the enhanced penalties. I would also call into question Scalia's assertion that the normal use of a gun is assumed to be as a weapon. And I'm no lawyer, but correct me, a weapon is an instrument, tool, machine, device used to do harm. It's the intent that matters. Alright? It's a firearm. It's only a weapon when you intend to do harm. So it seems to me in my naive mind that in this example there's been a conflation with firearm and gun to weapon. Are not US police issued with guns to use? That's kind of makes things a bit difficult all of a sudden, doesn't it? If we're assuming a gun is a weapon to be used, i.e. a device to do harm, is to be used and issued. State sanctioned. I don't know if that counts as prejudicial. Well, anyway, I only know enough to get beat up again, So while I wanted to use this example as a clear-cut example of textualism, it's also tainted by conflation in this example. The issue is pointed out. What does uses mean also? Discharging a firearm? Accidentally or with intent? Uses by brandishing it around merely as a threat to life with no actual intention of pulling the trigger but convincing the other party that we might. Or using it to club somebody across the back of the head with. Or keeping it holstered in open carry possibly is a message. We don't know what the intent is now. Maybe it's just a decoration. They like to carry a gun. Or maybe it's saying, yeah, I bet not fuck with me. Or just telling somebody that we have actually a concealed firearm. Is the thing now actually being used? Or is the idea of the thing being used? If it's concealed carry, we don't actually know whether there's the gun, but there is an idea or a thought, a possibility that there might be. So is gun, whether it exists, whether it's present or not, being used in this case? Anyway, on top of all this bullshit, and oblique to our interests, there is also the matter of the scriveners who do make errors from time to time and cause the text to have material defects. Interesting then when we have a literalist who will interpret the law as written and made no caveat about overcoming these defects that are to be found from time to time. Originalism, on the other hand, seeks to interpret law in the spirit and context of the times in which it was written. One obvious problem is where the originators anticipated that the future would change and made allowance for that. However, the language and words that they may have used 100 years ago, 200 years ago, might have had different meanings to the average person back then. And then the question of original intent or original meaning. As Amy Barrett said, she shall interpret the law as written. Well, if that's so, then why do we need interpreters at all? I think it's impossible to interpret in an unbiased way. There will always be bias. Can't get away from it. I suppose then interpretation is an attempt to establish relevance to the prevailing case. I'll go back to the example a moment ago, use of a firearm, and then the clause during and in relation with, in this case, drug trafficking. Well, when did the drug trafficking event start and end so that during is established? And what counts as in relation? The during bit, I suggest, will have objective markers. The relation, I don't know, more subjective, perhaps? Originalism has to be also subjective. How can we know the intent of someone else long dead? Likewise, how can we have no bias? It's inherent in the systems. It's inherent in human nature. We all have different cognitive abilities, different perceptions, different value hierarchies, different outlooks, different cultural biases installed. You can't get out of it. To state that oneself is bias-free is either naive or dishonest, and a Supreme Court judge, I assume, is not naive. Onlookers will be swayed by two circumstances. Either the inability to spot the bias, or that their own bias aligns, and thus no bias is actually detected. Again, themselves either naive or biased. Judicial discretion. I'd really like to know, but I suspect that the more authority and higher position in government and law, the more experienced one is assumed to be, and I suspect the more comprehensive insurance such professionals can buy. I'm just guessing here, but I wonder if the judges and justices' ability to try certain cases comes down to competence and their ability to secure adequate insurance premiums. Again, comes down to risk. Like the merchant credit card processors. They don't like chargebacks, and they will take a view of your company and estimate the number of chargebacks they think is likely from the way you operate, from your business plan, from the nature of your business and the potential demographic of your customers. And they will apply the relevant merchant fee in accordance with that risk. And I have to wonder likewise how many court cases has a judge had that went to appeal, and how many have, in effect, been charged back. That's a risk, and it all costs money. So at the time of recording, Judge Barrett said that she could not characterise facts in a hypothetical situation. Yes, it's hypothetical. There are no actual facts. It's a hypothetical. We already did casuistry, didn't we? It's how we learn shit. We make up pretend cases to work through the ifs and buts in an emotional free zone, so that when the time comes, we've already had practice run at thrashing out the arguments. Not to say that each case may be different, but the Barrett would not be drawn on whether it is illegal to intimidate voters at polling stations. Imagine going to a lawyer and seeking advice on a future course of action and its legality, and being told that they could not characterise hypotheticals. Hey, Mr. Policeman, can I drive my Ferrari full speed down the local high street tomorrow? And would that be legal? Well, I can't speculate to hypotheticals. I mean, if they really wanted to cover their ass, they could say, yes, that would be illegal unless extenuating circumstances, but that would not make it legal. It just means that you might be able to mitigate the consequences of breaking those laws. But in this hypothetical situation, yes, that would be illegal. It is written in the law. Voter intimidation is illegal. It's written in the Highway Traffic Act what the speed limits are and under what conditions. Extenuating circumstances, I presume, tried in court. However, the point is, these are things written down. As I find it a bit worrying, justice would equivocate something that is written down as hypothetical, having stated that they will interpret that law as written. What the fuck? So she was also asked, can the president unilaterally delay a general election for any reason under federal law? The answer is no. But Barrett again dodged and said again that this needs to be actually brought as a case and litigated to get her opinion. Again, it's written in the book. No, he does not have such authority. It seems dodgy to me to skirt these easy questions, which are pretty much yes-no answers. Yeah, I get why she won't be drawn. If one is committed to profound moral principles concerning ethical and religious belief, then personal conviction cannot be completely irrelevant to one's political stances on matters of public policy. You can't serve two masters at the same time. I might have been more believing if the person who said this stated it in the first person, that they think it would be wrong if they had an abortion. But to state that they think abortion is wrong as a general principle, and then go on to support a public policy of pro-choice, seems at odds. It seems the way of the pragmatist to thread this needle. I don't know. Public policies are indeed a matter of group agreement and concession to those laws that we do not agree with. And at this point, it's too easy and too tempting to question a person's position like this on terms of character. Too easily is boiled down to, oi, hypocrite, or other ad hominem. It seeks to attack the person's motives and their integrity, and the actual merits of the case are sidetracked. We talked about Trump's tweets a couple of episodes back, that he does the same thing, and he's certainly taken one for the team. Boy oh boy, he's been an excellent frontman, there's no denying that, but with horrible consequences. He's protected many a vested interest and protected many a wealthy person. I suspect it will go down as one of the huge shifts in wealth of recent times. Yeah, so we should be cautious, though, when arguing on these grounds of apparent hypocrisy. First, as I say, the actual argument on abortion is shifted to the integrity and the intent of the official elect, and if we're not careful, it simply degrades into personal abuse. So we have to be cautious to stay on target. We have to keep on the argument and forget about the bias and opinion of the elected official or not. But what are the actual arguments as to the principle and the arguments to the consequence? Abortion seems to cut right into this question of rule-based ethics. Thou shalt not kill. And a consequentialist argument. What's the greater good for the greater number of people? And to add nuance, the current issues in Poland around abortion right now are interesting, in respect of it being the most Catholic country in Europe. Public protest at the closure of the loophole that allowed for abortions has been significant. It's just about made abortions illegal. The ruling made by the Polish Constitutional Courts, supported, it seems, by the Polish Episcopal Conference and governing nationalist PIS party, a nationalist conservative Christian right-wing party. Again, the right always seem to want to micromanage and control and restrict rights. Why is that? It's very the same as with religion. Anyway, so should you act according to the best possible outcome, or act in regard to doing the right thing, regardless of outcome? And in regard to the best possible outcome, maximum benefits, reduced suffering, how can we measure quantitatively or qualitatively pain and pleasure and suffering? How can we agree on the good? Who's good? Over what time period good? In what context good? Rule-based ethics gets into the same trouble. If the principles are rock solid and never change, there is the question of interpreting those rules. I've sniped at fundamentalist religions here and poked fun at the recent tremor in the Catholics, whereby the verbiage of the baptism was changed, which called into the question confirmations, and indeed the interpretation of sacred texts and the interpretation of so-called modern intellectuals, not real intellectuals, but more dark web intellectuals, who either obfuscate or move the goalposts when asked to clarify. Interpretation of the rules, then, is somewhat subjective. Perhaps why such tasks are allocated to a select few in law also. Now, I'm reckoning this isn't just a matter of interpretation, but also in the application of being a governor, in the mechanical sense, as a retarding device, or a meaning buffer, if you like. Take, for example, the urban language of the internet. Words come and go and their meaning changes so fast. Poggers, what the fuck's that? You have to keep up with the lingo or it's difficult to communicate. I can think of political correctness, co-opted to now be meaningless. Other words include random, now used to mean something weird rather than something unpredictable with no discernible pattern. Ironic is currently taking a bit of a bashing. When it comes to law and contracts and meanings of agreements, it's perhaps a good thing that the meaning of such instruments is not preserved but smoothed out. What I'm trying to say is that if the meanings of the words and the meanings of the contract change from day to day, contract's meaningless. But if it also lasts forever, it's perhaps also unenforceable. Hence, these people who interpret meaning are perhaps keepers of the flame, as it were. They kind of set durations on things that are reasonable and workable. Divine command theory being one of those, and has many different interpretations, all of which I presume have their ardent followers, until they do not. And then the in vogue interpretation lives on until it doesn't. Ironically, and in the true meaning of ironically, this is a demonstration of evolution in action. Quite funny, yes. The religions themselves follow the evolutionary process. I'm sure you've noticed too that there are cases where rule-based communities have their leaders who do live up to the word and do act in strict accordance with the rules, dogma and doctrine. And in some cases where they deviate, they are seen as a poor exemplar or called out for being a hypocrite. And in some cases, this is deviant behaviour. And it's actually called out exactly as that. And then it shatters the illusion of the community, which is a consequentialist consideration. So I wonder what's going on in the cases of religious leaders who have been caught abusing children. It all seems to be done behind closed doors. Why is that? That the matter is settled privately, or that it's settled at all, or that it doesn't leak into the community, thereby shattering the illusion that the religious leaders are totally virtuous, but actually are deviants. How can you go to a congregation led by a deviant? It shatters the illusion. It's also hypocritical on the one hand, saying yes, piety, virtuousness, glory of God, you can find your salvation here while I abuse you. So even here, there seems to be this bouncing back and forth between rules and consequence. However, I suspect that's the PR team. I suspect that's the lawyers that are paid to protect these institutions. And along the way, I suspect we've found out a few things through these trial and errors, like slavery bad, human trafficking bad. But just because they are bad, is that a strong enough argument that prescribes a rule, never do it? Yes, as it turns out, I think there are international laws agreed and adopted into domestic legislation that makes slavery and human trafficking and genocide illegal. But turns out there are now more slaves than there ever have been. And I'm not even talking about debt servitude, but actual slaves, about 40 million. And I think this also was worth a quick mention, that we might make laws and rules that make certain things prohibited and illegal because we don't want to afford time and opportunity for people to find out why committing murder is bad. We don't want them to actually experience the consequences to then go, yeah, you know what, I've done the murder, you're right, it is bad, if only someone had told me. And it seems again that we have to hold in mind what kind of persons are we talking to, consequentialists or people who have high priority on virtue. How can we make our case to them? Do we appeal to their virtue, or do we show them the consequences? Again, I covered this in the video number 9. Talking cross purposes just seems to clash. Yeah, so 40 million slaves it's estimated there are. And that's not counting prison populations that are used as labour. For example, as the prison firefighters. It's not including the engineered to fail sharecropping schemes. And if you stop and think about how those prison populations are grown and literally cultivated, specifically in the United States. Yeah, war on drugs. When did that start? 1970, 1971. That was Nixon, and it cost $1 trillion. Yeah, I don't think it's just a mere coincidence that this was all started shortly after the 1965 Voting Act right that prohibited racial discrimination in voting. The 1968 Fair Housing Act that prohibited housing discrimination on the basis of race. 2.3 million people are locked up in the United States of Americana land. That's about 3% of the UK population. 25% of those are for drug offences. A lot of those bogus. I mean, in actual number, but perhaps a small percentage. Study after study has shown drug treatment has better outcomes than incarceration, and that incarceration costs $80 billion a year to the US taxpayers and a further $100 billion in associated costs. The drug war. 40 years it's been going on, and if anything, the problem has got worse. And, by the way, 5.3 million Americans are barred from voting in this general election due to felony disenfranchisement. Why can't I say that word? It's because I've spelt it wrong on the screen. Felony disenfranchisement. No, fuck, I still can't say it. Felony disenfranchisement. So that amounts for 2.5% of the US voting population. Oh, and by the way, this recent revelation in the United States of Americana land, where 540 odd children have been separated from their parents, the immigration thing, how does it start? As mentioned, the parents making a decision, taking a shot at giving their kids a better life. Sadly, we're not going to find most of those parents. Some may no longer even be with us. Some may even have taken the heart-wrenching decisions to not be found on purpose in the hopes that their child will remain within the borders of the United States. Some of those parents won't even have a home to go back to, perhaps merely a road designation in a refugee camp. So what to do? The kids can't be blamed, and therefore it would seem a very wicked act to punish them for actions of their parents. It seems this has been done so as a deterrent to future parents who would attempt to cross borders with their children, and, as Trump referenced in his last debate, that they are sometimes coyoted over. This is where a person pays a third party to take their kids over a border crossing. And you have to ask, how awful must the living conditions be that a parent sends their child to a foreign country, knowing that they may not ever see them again? If it is punitive action, then it is prohibited by law. In which case, this is a case of a country breaking international treaties. See previous video for the 4 conditions of a failed state, not to mention the loss of moral authority. And, by the way, the very term forcible transfer of children is a euphemism for kidnapping and human trafficking. Yeah, it's governments that do that too. The United Nations Convention of the Prevention and Punishment of Genocide prohibits the forcible transfer of children from one group to another. And I've not kept up with those alleged cases of involuntary sterilisation of the women held in detention centres. I'm left thinking then, if we've worked out these things are bad, why do they still happen? Individual choices, which seem to come down to having that moral compass or not, character, or perhaps even virtuous ethics, the integrity to be honest, and call slavery, and to call genocide, and not to dress it up in euphemisms. It seems some people do know it is wrong and use euphemistic language to get out on a technicality. So we have phrases like white ethno-state, euphemism for genocide in non-whites, domestic labour, forced labour, euphemisms for child abuse, sex trafficking, human trafficking, slavery and worse. So I had made a note here to talk about situational awareness, but crikey, it's going to drag on if I do. I'll have to put that in its own video. But this was a note to make about perceptual shifts. What is better for everyone? How can we know that if our perceptions are sensitive to the situation and being aware not only of our context but of others? How do you know? It comes back to communicating and asking as far as possible. And by what method do we have for that dialogue? Questionnaires, surveys, sampling, consensus, interactive dialogues with so-called stakeholders. Even here it's not so straightforward. Social and human dynamics contain asymmetrical effects. There was a phrase I think I introduced in the behavioural economics series that I only got into 2 out of 20 I'm doing. There are reasons whereby people withhold expressing their true preference, and in others there's this acquiescence bias. So asking people isn't always entirely accurate. Who's asking the questions can skew the results. Or actually more specifically and accurately, who it is perceived as doing the asking can skew results. So a lot of it is also hidden. A lot of things are obfuscated by so many levels, the big questions to ask are, what backs currency? What gives it its value? Where does money actually come from? When you buy a product, say from a supermarket, would they tell you the cost of the raw materials and the cost of products to them? I.e., will they disclose their profit margins? Probably not. And although things are I don't know whether some say they're getting better, and there are anti-slavery and anti-exploitative legislation these days, is it actually possible to trace all the consequences of using materials and resources that had to be acquired to build your mobile phone? I'm sure you are aware of a few of those consequences. For example, the coltan, the lithium, the geopolitical issues that are caused now down the so-called ABC corridor, where lithium is mined for all those batteries. Aha, well done, Bolivia. ABC, I think, is Australia, Bolivia and Chile. And it seems the population of Chile are gunning for a new constitution. Tesla didn't take too much of a stock hit. I think on the news of Bolivia, Tesla's stock dipped 5% from 4.30 to 4.10. A lot of the time, though, commercial interests hide the consequences. They are kept off book and definitely out of the advertising. I've stated it before, though without evidential support, that there is no longer any ethical consumption. It all does harm. Yep, even driving the car, catching the plane, overconsumption of food waste. We all know this, I'm sure. We all do it. In fact, the problem with food is that the margins are so slim that for it to continue as a going concern, it has to sell twice as much food as consumption demands. In other words, to survive, it is compelled to be wasteful. Strange incentives are set up. I haven't looked at it in a while, but even the local chippy, they lose money on the cod, on the fish, but make up for it on the chips. And it's the chips what ain't good for you. Fucking, probably the salmon isn't anymore. Jesus Christ, fucking salmon from the Baltic. Oh. But they're not going to make 50 pence profit on a 30 pence bag of chips. So they're compelled to sell chips at £1 a bag, £1.20, £1.30, £1.50. And that bag is now necessarily large to support the hedonic pleasure of the purchaser. I.e., they want a lot of chips for their £1, regardless of whether they will eat it or bin half of it. And the size of those cod too, my God. And, we did fishing rights in the last video. And I don't know whether this is an appropriate time for a rant on what's actually going on in the Baltic with salmon fishing, the food industry, and vested interests of government ministers who own 80% of chemical supply companies that are used in the processing. It's all a mess. From what I know, the fishmongers in such regions are now giving warnings that pregnant women shouldn't eat these fish and that only 1 or 2 portions per week are to be consumed anyway due to contamination with dioxins and PCBs. And let's not even mention basa fish, swai. used extensively in international fish markets and supplied to schools because it's cheap. And there's a reason for that, for fuck's sake. Like I say, no ethical consumption left. It's not so much that there's a problem with the fish itself, it's the farming practices, but then some say domestic supplies are more suitable, and I'm wondering what information is protectionism and propaganda in what is otherwise a trade war. You know, we have a really poor opinion in the West of Vietnamese and Indonesian fishing practices. The press and collusion and vested interests have somewhat smeared them so that we prefer the homegrown stuff, which, although perhaps more heavily regulated, sometimes is actually worse than fishes coming in from far, far away. The chlorinated chickens, the rewriting of food regulations in light of a Brexit. And I find it awfully convenient, a point we'll come back to later, that there are many that deny anthropogenic climate change. Oh, and just to add to the woes, I'm hearing that Japan is set to dump a load of contaminated water from the Fukushima disaster into the ocean over a period of decades. And of course, concerns about contaminating the local fish stock have been raised. There's no easy alternative, they say. Another option, they say, expanding capacity and storing the water on land or underground, would see 97% of the tritium decay within 60 years due to its short half-life. But that needs to be weighed against the cost and the risk of those tanks leaking in an earthquake-prone region. Instead of putting them in tanks for 60 years, which gives us a chance of getting the tritium decay down to 97%, let's just simulate an earthquake now and release it into the ocean anyway. Genius. It is said, the person who wrote this report, it is probably the sensible option because anything else causes bigger problems. Don't you hear when someone says that it's a matter of convenience rather than the right thing to do? The right thing to do is hard. The right thing to do is costly. The right thing to do is inconvenient, and the right thing to do is a big problem. But it's too much of a big problem. Let's just not do it and just let it all wash out into the ocean. That mindset and response from someone who I suppose is a professional is mind-blowing. It's saying, hey, we've got a big problem, we need to fix it. Yeah, I tell you what, let's just not do that. There you go, problem solved. Consequences. I keep hearing those nuclear power stations are safe. Well, you know, 3 Mile Island, Windscale, Fukushima, Daiichi, Chernobyl, of course, Enrico Fermi Unit 1, and that big fucking hole that they've dug in the hard rock of Olkiluoto. Apart from practical issues, consider the moral issue. In effect, what we are saying is we do not know how to handle this toxic stuff, but we hope future generations will work it out, and we pass the buck to them. It's reckoned that a repository of this kind costs around 4 billion quid, and for reference, a 1 megawatt wind turbine comes in at around 1.25 million. And I'm tempted to do the energy equation. 4 billion buys a lot of wind turbines, and this 4 billion is just the price tag of the waste storage plant. Again, it's the same problem with the food industry. To make these projects financially viable, the governments have to effectively underwrite the project by guaranteeing electricity prices, which means that alternatives can't sell lecky at their competitive price. It doesn't allow them to undercut the market. So, you know, free market economists, where are you? Libertarians, where are you? I've asked the question before. Those 15% returns on investments in Eastern European hotels, you know, don't ask, don't get told lies. Why is it that a hotel in the middle of nowhere has 95% occupancy all year round? And this isn't some QAnon Wayfair bullshit conspiracy. The willful ignorance. Just take the returns, ask no questions. It's in our language. We already mentioned the different cuts of meat that we can order at the restaurant. It makes us sound discerning and sophisticated and distances us from the matter of eating another sentient being. And I've harped on about it. Dave Grossman's book here on killing and the use of language to distance ourselves from the most abhorrent of acts. Not so much killing as neutralising the enemy combatants. Not so much torture, but enhanced interrogation techniques. Not so much as innocent women and children eviscerated by red-hot shrapnel, but collateral damage. It's a mental magic, yeah. We did this bit already, I think. Don't think of Trump riding an elephant down Fifth Avenue while dressed only in boxer shorts with the stars and stripes. I said, don't think of that. But it also works in reverse. Well, not so much reverse, but the non-mirror image inverse. So if I don't want to conjure up grotesque images of shredded and charred body parts of what was once a young child, I can use the phrase collateral damage. And maybe if I mention for a third time that collateral damage is really the smeared trails of other human beings, perhaps next time you hear the term on the news or on TV, the association will stick, just like the icky, rotting, liquefied flesh still attached to something partially recognisable as a not nice responsibility diffused out. In the process of diffusing this responsibility is also a moral failing. Why does poverty exist? Why are some people pushed into involuntary servitude? Why are there 40 million modern-day slaves? It may be their choice was to enter slavery or die. So we could evaluate those circumstances are improved, but why in the first place were their circumstances so bad that the only choice otherwise for them was death? What moral failing occurred to bring about these circumstances in the first place? I'm working up to it.